people who worked in fields related to death. Share with us your best paranormal story during your internship. I worked at a funeral home. There were rumors that the ghost of an elderly deputy director haunted the place. He had a heart attack there and died. All this ghost did was play with the lights in the building. If you called out to him, like, "John, please don't do this. Your family is here," the lights would immediately stop flickering. It's not that I believe a ghost really haunted the place, but if I said something, the light issue would immediately get fixed. So while I was there, I kept talking to myself. I work as a nurse in the intensive care unit. We had a patient with sepsis in our department. She was 29 weeks pregnant. During my shift, she started having contractions, and we delivered a stillborn baby. I performed postmortem care for the baby, placed it in the appropriate container, and took it to the morgue. It was very late at night, and I was alone in the elevator. Suddenly, I heard the baby crying. I was stunned. I immediately opened the container lid, and just as I was about to unzip the bag, I heard a calming male voice. "Hush, little one. I'm with you. Don't cry." The crying stopped right away. I opened the bag and saw exactly what I expected to see. The stillborn baby at 29 weeks of gestation. I'm a big, bearded 40-year-old nurse working in intensive care, and this was the scariest thing that ever happened to me. No one believes me to this day, and I don't even want to speculate about where that cry came from or who the voice belonged to. God, just writing this comment, I felt my chest tighten. After a fire was put out, during the cleanup of the burned building, my colleague discovered a corpse. Unfortunately, it sometimes happens that you find a dead person, and if you step on them, if the body is relatively intact, you bounce off. But if it's badly burned, the body often crunches under the weight of your boot. So, my friend stepped right onto the chest of a severely burned body. There was a crunch, it was the rib cage. When he tried to pull his foot out, it got stuck in the ribs, and the body jerked toward him. The burned arms started flailing back and forth. After several attempts, he finally managed to free the body, which looked like a zombie clutching his leg. After that, the poor guy had to see a psychologist. I worked as a nurse in an oncology department. We had rooms where patients were receiving palliative care already close to death. One early morning, one of the patients we had been caring for several weeks passed away. The night staff had already transferred the patient to the morgue. Our job was just to tidy up the room and remove all the personal belongings and the deceased. I sent a nursing student whom I was mentoring at the time to handle the task. Meanwhile, I was doing my rounds. The student knew the patient well and immediately agreed to do what I asked. About 10 minutes later, my colleague came to me and said that the student had run out of the room, pale as a sheet, and was crying in the doctor's office. I went to her to find out what happened. The student told me that she was washing the sink in the bathroom, then looked up and saw the reflection of the deceased patient in the mirror. He was looking at her from over her shoulder. My student was a sensible girl, not prone to hysteria, but she never went near that room again during her internship. When I was a child, my mom used to tell me various stories about her work. After finishing nursing school, she started working in the ICU at an old hospital in Virginia in the mid-1980s. There were two ghosts in the hospital, the man in the hat and patient number 1. Most of the nurses had seen them. The man in the hat usually appeared near the rooms after visiting hours. Shortly after his appearance, the patient in the room would die. Patient number 1 was a woman in an old hospital gown who wandered the corridors and entered the rooms of patients. The hospital's ICU staff considered the man in the hat a harbinger of death and the woman assigned to bring in the resuscitation trolley. Let me tell you the story of how my grandfather died. One time, some of my cousins and I were playing in the yard. We were out in the countryside for the weekend, spending time with our family. We were having fun outside when we saw our grandfather, Lola. He was walking straight toward the house. We all greeted him and he smiled back. He climbed the stairs to the porch and hung his hat on the door. We went back to playing, but shortly after we heard crying coming from the house. At that moment, my uncle arrived. We all ran inside to find out what had happened, and we saw everyone gathered in the kitchen, crying. They told us that early in the morning, Grandpa Lola had passed away, and they had just found out. He lived many miles away from us. My cousins and I exchanged looks and told the adults we had just seen him entering the house. They didn't believe us, so we pointed out that he had hung his hat on the door. They rushed to the door, and indeed, the hat was there where we said it was. He never went anywhere without that hat. My cousins and I ran through the house calling out for Grandpa, while the adults just stood there in shock. It turned out that Grandpa had passed away that morning, and my grandmother couldn't find his hat anywhere in the house. In the end, we left the hat where it hung, and no one touched it. I don't work in this field, but I had one experience that I want to share. My father was in the hospital. I was at home, turned off my phone, and fell asleep. Around 1 a.m., I heard a doorbell. I got up to check who it was, but there was no one at the door. I walked around the whole house, but couldn't find anyone. Then I turned my phone back on, and almost immediately, I received a call from the hospital telling me that my father had just passed away and asked if they could take some of his organs for transplant. I worked as a driver at a funeral home, taking bodies in the hearse. Nothing particularly creepy ever happened, just a couple of funny incidents, some with religious overtones, and overall it was a nice, low-stress job. But one night, I had a very strange feeling when I had to pick up a man who had died at home. He still had the wires from the defibrillator on his chest, and his eyes were closed, which was strange because dead people's eyes are usually open. He looked as if he was just sleeping or unconscious. His skin wasn't pale, and his muscles weren't stiff. I spent about half an hour in traffic, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to wake up in the body bag and start gasping for air. Then I had this strange thought, it would be nice if he did wake up. I would take him back home, and he could be with his family again. I drove faster, turned on some music, started singing along, and talking to him. When I arrived at the funeral home, I decided not to put him in the freezer for about an hour. I spent the time doing paperwork and playing on my phone. When I checked on him again, I realized his limbs had started to stiffen. I was really upset and put him in the freezer. My roommate is my best friend who works at a funeral home. I've often visited there and got to know the staff well. Nothing unusual has ever happened, but I've encountered some unexplained things in my life. I was a bit surprised that none of the staff had ever witnessed anything strange, especially since some of them believe in ghosts and such. However, they told me an interesting idea. If ghosts really existed, they wouldn't hang around a funeral home. What would they be doing there? A funeral home is just a transitional place like an airport. No one would want to linger in a damned airport. Ghosts usually stay where they died or where their loved ones live or in homes they don't want to leave. Who would want to hang around a funeral home, a place they have no attachment to, where their body ended up only after they passed away? I work as a nurse in palliative care for terminally ill patients. I didn't believe in such things until I started working in this field. I want to share with you 3 cases. Before I worked in palliative care, I worked in a regular hospital department. One time, around 3 a.m., coming back from a break, I saw a man standing at the door of my patient's room. He was a white, fit man, around 45 years old, with dark hair, wearing a hospital gown. He stood at the door, arms crossed. When I walked closer, he turned and entered the room. I followed him because I knew it wasn't his room. We had a large department with 36 beds, so it was possible that it was a patient I hadn't seen yet. I think you already know what happened next. I entered the room, and he was nowhere to be found. I even looked under the bed for no particular reason. No one could have hidden there. I checked the cabinets, the bathroom, and behind the curtains, he was gone. Later that night, my colleague told me how she had felt as though someone was touching her legs when she was trying to rest during a break. Our office was near the room where my patient was, and she was there at the same time I saw that man. Now I want to tell you 2 moments about working in palliative care. Patients often introduce me to their deceased relatives who are with them or say that people are waiting for them there or are with them in their room. This is a very common story. Many people know they're about to die and look forward to meeting their loved ones. I believe this because with our younger patients, who aren't ready to die yet, there's often a high level of anxiety. Many times, young patients have begged me, saying something like, "Help me, I'm going to die today." It felt like they had fought with all their strength until the very end, but then something happened to them, or they saw something and realized that their time had come. There was a time when I was providing hospice care at home to a man in his 50s who was dying of lung cancer related to his work. I knew he was about to pass, so I asked his relatives if they wanted to invite anyone to say goodbye. Around 1 a.m., his 90-year-old father, brother, distant relatives, and friends gathered at his house. I left them alone and sat in the kitchen. At some point, I heard a loud sound from a set of bells. There are musical hanging ornaments that make a sound, but this sound was so unnatural it didn't stop. A minute later, his daughter came in and told me that her father had passed away. I usually don't share with the family of the deceased about paranormal occurrences, but I couldn't help but comment on the sound of the bells. The daughter said, "That's not surprising. He collected bells." She turned on the lights outside, and I saw hundreds of bells that had been silent all night until he passed away. Thank you so much for watching. Share your similar stories in the comments below the video, and don't forget to check out our other episodes.